Hey everybody, I have a lightsaber. That's so neat. Oh, you think you're funny too, huh? Love you, puppy. Okay. So, Chapter 9, in which Michael has trouble with a spell. It was the sea captain at the door, come for his wind spell at last, and not at all pleased at having to wait. If I miss my tide, boy, he said to Michael, I shall have a word with that sorcerer about you. I don't like lazy boys. Michael, in Sophie's opinion, was far too polite to him, but she was feeling too dejected to interfere. When the captain had gone, Michael went to the bench to frown over his spell again, and Sophie sat silently mending her stockings. She'd only the one pair, and her knobbly feet had worn huge holes in them. Her gray dress was by this time frayed and dirty. She wondered whether she dared cut up the least stained bits out of Howl's ruined blue and silver suit, to make herself a new skirt with. But she did not quite dare. Sophie, Michael said, looking up from his 11th page of the notes, how many nieces have you? Sophie had been afraid that Michael would start asking questions. When you get my age, my lad, you start to lose count. They all look so alike. Those two leddies could be twins, to my mind. Oh, no, not really, Michael said, to her surprise. The niece in upper folding isn't as pretty as my Letty. He tore up the 11th page and made a 12th. I'm glad Howl didn't meet my Letty, he said. He began on his 13th page and tore that one up too. I wanted to laugh when that Mrs. Fairfax said she knew who Howl was, didn't you? No, said Sophie. It had made no difference to Letty's feelings. She thought of Letty's bright, adoring face on the apple blossom. I suppose there's no chance, she asked hopelessly, that Howl could be properly in love this time. Calcifer snorted green sparks at the chimney. I was afraid you'd start thinking that, Michael said. Bet you'd be deceiving yourself, just like Mrs. Fairfax. Well, how do you know? Said Sophie. Calcifer and Michael exchanged glances. Did he forget to spend at least an hour in the bathroom this morning? Michael asked. He was in there for 2 hours, said Calcifer, putting spells on his face. Vain fool. Well, there you are then, said Michael. The day Howl forgets to do that will be the day that I believe that he is really in love, and not before. Sophie thought of Howl on one knee in the orchard, posing to look as handsome as possible. And she knew that they were right. She thought of going to the bathroom and tipping all of Howl's beauty spells down the toilet. But she did not quite dare. Instead, she hobbled up and fetched the blue and silver suit, which she spent the rest of the day cutting little blue triangles out of in order to make a patchwork sort of skirt. Michael patted her shoulder kindly as he came to throw all 17 pages of his notes onto Calcifer. Everyone gets over things in the end, you know, he said. By this time, it was clear Michael was having trouble with his spell. He gave up the notes and scraped some soot off the chimney. Calcifer craned round to watch him in a mystified way. Michael took a withered root from one of the bags hanging on the beams and put it in the soot. Then, after much thought, he turned the doorknob, blew down, and vanished for 20 minutes into Porthaven. He came back with a large whorled seashell and put that with the root and the soot, which don't rhyme because English is weird. After that, he tore up the pages and put those in too. He put the lot in front of the human skull and stood blowing on it so that the soot and bits of paper whirled all over the bench. What's he doing, do you think? Calcifer asked Sophie. Michael gave up blowing and started mashing everything, paper and all, with a pestle and mortar, looking at the skull expectantly from time to time. Nothing happened, so he tried different ingredients from bags and jars. I feel bad about spying on Howl, he announced as he pounded a third set of ingredients to death in the bowl. He may be fickle to females, but he's been awfully good to me. He took me in when I was just an unwanted orphan sitting on his doorstep in Porthaven. How did
did that come about?
asked Sophie as she snipped out another blue triangle. Well, my mother my mother died and my father got drowned in a storm, Michael said. And nobody wants you when that happens. I had to leave our house because I couldn't pay rent, and I tried to live in the streets, but people kept turning me off of doorsteps and out of boats until the only place I could think of to go was somewhere that everyone else was too scared to interfere with. Howl just started up in a small way as Sorcerer Jenkins then, but everyone said his house had devils in it, so I slept on his doorstep for a couple of nights until Howl opened the door one morning on his way to buy bread, and I fell inside. So he said I could wait indoors while he got something to eat. I went in, and, well, there was Calcifer, and I started talking to him because I'd never met a demon before.
What do you talk about?
Said Sophie, wondering if Calcifer had asked Michael to break his contract too.
He told me his troubles, and he dripped on me, didn't you? Said Calcifer. It didn't seem to occur to him that I might have troubles as well.
I don't think that you have. You just grumble a lot, Michael said. You were quite nice to me that morning, and I think Howl was impressed. But you know how he is. He didn't tell me I could stay. He just didn't tell me to go. So I started being useful wherever I could, like looking after money so that he didn't spend it all as soon as he got it, and so on. The spell gave a sort of a then and exploded mildly. Michael brushed soot off the skull, sighing, and tried new ingredients. Sophie began making a patchwork of blue triangles around her feet on the floor. I did make lots of stupid mistakes when I first started, Michael went on. Howl was awfully nice about it. I thought I'd got over that by now, and I think I do help with the money. Howl buys such expensive clothes. He says no one's going to employ a wizard who looks as if he can't make money at the trade.
That's just because he likes clothes, said Calcifer.
His orange eyes watched Sophie at work rather meaningly.
This suit was spoiled, Sophie said.
Well, it isn't just clothes, Michael said. Remember last winter when we were down to your last log and Howl went off and bought the skull and that stupid guitar? I was really annoyed with him. He said they looked good.
What did you do about logs?
Sophie asked. Howl conjured some from someone who owed him money, Michael said. At least he said they did, and I just hope he was telling the truth. And we ate seaweed. Howl says it's good for you.
Nice stuff,
murmured Calcifer.
Dry and crackly.
I hate it, said Michael, staring abstractedly at his bowl of pounded stuff. I don't know, there should be 7 ingredients, unless it's 7 processes, but let's try it in a pentacle anyway. He put the bowl on the floor and chalked a sort of 5-pointed star around it. The powder exploded with a force that blew Sophie's triangles into the hearth. Michael swore and hurriedly rubbed out the chalk marks. Sophie, I'm stuck with this spell. You don't think you could possibly help me, do you? Just like someone bringing their homework to their granny, Sophie thought, collecting the triangles and patiently laying them out again.
Well, let's have a look, she said cautiously. I don't know anything about magic, you know.
Michael eagerly thrust a strange, slightly shiny paper onto her hand. It looked unusual, even for a spell. It was printed in bold letters, but they were slightly gray and blurred, and there were gray blurs like retreating storm clouds round all the edges. See what you think, said Michael. Sophie read. Go and catch a falling star, get a child with a mandrake root, tell me where your past years are, or who cleft the devil's foot. Teach me to hear the mermaids singing, or to keep off envy's stinging, and find what wind serves to advance an honest mind. Decide what this is about. Write a second verse yourself. It puzzled Sophie exceedingly. It was not quite like any of the spells that she'd snooped at before. She plowed through it twice, not really helped by Michael eagerly explaining as she tried to read. You know, Howl told me that advanced spells have a puzzle in them. Well, I decided at first that every line was meant to be a puzzle. I used soot with sparks in for the falling star, and a seashell for the mermaids singing, and I thought I might count as a child, so I got a mandrake root down, and I wrote out lists for past years from Almanacs, but I wasn't sure what that was about, and maybe that's where I went wrong. And could the thing that stops stinging be dockleaf? I hadn't thought of that before. Anyway, none of this works.
I'm not surprised, said Sophie. It looks to me like it's a set of impossible things to do.
Opal, I would really much rather that you chew on your chew bone instead of your cardboard. Oh, I wanted to go to bed. She's laughing at me. But Michael was not having that. If the things were impossible, he pointed out reasonably, no one would ever be able to do the spell. And, he added, I'm so ashamed of spying on Howl that I want to make up for it by getting at least this spell right.
Very well, said Sophie. Let's start with decide what this is about. That ought to start things moving, if deciding is part of the spell anyway.
But Michael was not having that either. No, he said, it's the sort of spell that reveals itself as you do it. That's what the last line means. When you write the second half saying what the spell means, that's what makes it work. Those kinds are very advanced. We have to crack the first bit first. Sophie collected her blue triangles into a pile again.
Well, let's ask Calcifer, she suggested. Calcifer, who?
But this was yet another thing Michael did not let her do. No, be quiet. I think Calcifer's part of the spell. Look at the way it says, tell me and teach me. I thought at first that it meant teach the skull, but that didn't work. So it must be Calcifer.
Well, you can do it by yourself if you sit on everything I have to say, Sophie said. Anyway, surely Calcifer must know who cleft his own foot.
Calcifer flared up a little at this.
I haven't got any feet. I'm a demon, not a devil.
Saying which, he retreated right under his logs, where he could be heard chinking about and muttering.
Lots of nonsense.
All the rest of the time, Sophie and Michael were discussing the spell. By this time, the puzzle had got a grip on Sophie. She packed away her blue triangles, fetched pen and paper, and started making notes in the same sort of quantities that Michael had. For the rest of the day, she and Michael sat staring into the distance, nibbling quills and throwing out suggestions at one another. An average page of Sophie's notes read, Does garlic keep off envy? I could cut a star out of paper and drop it. Could we tell it to Howl? Howl would like mermaids better than Calcifer. Don't think Howl's mind honest. Is Calcifer's... Where are past years anyway? Does it mean one of those dry roots must bear fruit? Plant it next to dockleaf in a seashell? Cloven hoof, that's most things but horses. Shoe a horse with a clove of garlic. Wind. Smell. Wind of 7-league boots. Is Howl devil? Cloven toes in 7-league boots. Mermaids in boots? As Sophie wrote this, Michael asked equally desperately, could the wine be some sort of a pulley? An honest man being hanged? That's black magic, though.
Let's have supper, said Sophie.
They ate bread and cheese, still staring into the distance. At last, Sophie said,
Michael, for goodness sake, let's give up guessing and try doing just what it says. Where's the best place to catch a shooting star? Out on the hills?
Port Haven marshes are flatter, Michael said. Can we? I mean, shooting stars go awfully fast.
So can we in 7-league boots, Sophie pointed out.
Michael sprang up, full of relief and delight. I think you got it, he said, scrambling for the boots. Let's go and try. This time, Sophie prudently took her stick and her shawl, since it was now quite dark. Michael was turning the doorknob, blew down, and when two strange things happened. On the bench, the teeth of the skull started clattering, and Calcifer blazed right up the chimney. I don't want you to go, he said. We'll be back soon, Michael said soothingly. They went out into the street in Port Haven. It was a bright and balmy night. As soon as they had reached the end of the street, however, Michael remembered that Sophie had been ill that morning and began worrying about the effect of the night air on her health. Sophie told him not to be silly. She stumped gamely along with her stick until they left the lighted windows behind and the night became wide and damp and chilly. The marshes smelled of salt and earth, The sea glittered and softly swished to the rear. Sophie could feel more than see the miles and miles of flatness stretching away in front of them. What she could see were bands of low bluish mist and pale glimmers of marshy pools, over and over again until they built into a pale line where the sky started. The sky was everywhere else, hung huger still. The Milky Way looked like a band of mist risen from the marshes, and the keen stars twinkled through it. Michael and Sophie stood, each with a boot, ready on the ground in front of them, waiting for one of the stars to move. After about an hour, Sophie had to pretend she was not shivering for fear of worrying Michael. Half an hour later, Michael said, "Well, May is not the right time of year. August or November is best." Half an hour after that, he said in a worried way, "What do we do about the mandrake root?"
"Let's see this part before we worry about that," Sophie said, biting her teeth together while she spoke, for fear that they would chatter.
Some time later, Michael said, "You go home, Sophie. It's my spell after all." Sophie had her mouth open to say that this was a very good idea, when one of the stars came unstuck from the firmament and darted in a white streak down the sky. "There's one!" Sophie shrieked instead. Michael thumped his foot into his boot and was off. Sophie braced herself with a stick and was off a second later. Zip! Squash! Down far out in the marshes with the mist and the emptiness and dull glimmering pools in all directions. Sophie stabbed her stick into the ground and managed to stand still. Michael's boot was a dark blot standing just beside her. Michael himself was a sploshy sound of madly running feet somewhere ahead. And there was the falling star. Sophie could see it, a little white descending flame shape a few yards beyond the dark movements that were Michael. The bright shape was coming down slowly now, and it looked as if Michael might catch it. Sophie dragged her shoe out of the boot. "Come on, stick," she crowed. "Get me there!" And she set off at top hobble, leaping across tussocks and staggering through pools with her eyes on that little white light. By the time she'd caught up, Michael was stalking the star with soft steps, both arms out to catch it. Sophie could see him outlined against the star's light. The star was drifting level with Michael's hands, and only a step or so beyond. It was looking back at him nervously. How odd, Sophie thought. It was made of light. It lit up a white ring of grass and reeds and black pools around Michael, and yet it had big, anxious eyes peering backwards at Michael, and a small, pointed face. Sophie's arrival frightened it. It gave an erratic swoop and cried out in a shrill, crackling voice, "What is it? What do you want?" Sophie tried to say to Michael to do stop, it's terrified, but she had no breath left to speak with. "I only want to catch you," Michael explained. "I don't want to hurt you." "No, no!" the star crackled desperately. "That's wrong. I'm supposed to die." "But I could save you if you'd let me catch you," Michael told it gently. "No, I'd rather die." It dove away from Michael's fingers. Michael plunged for it, but it was too quick for him. It swooped for the nearest marsh pool, and the black water leapt into a blaze of whiteness for just an instant. Then there was a small, dying sizzle. When Sophie hobbled over, Michael was standing watching the last light fade out of a little round lump under the dark water. "Oh, that was sad," Sophie said. "Yes, my heart sort of went out to it. Let's go home. I'm sick of this spell." It took them 20 minutes to find the boots. Sophie thought it was a miracle that they found them at all. "You know," Michael said as they trudged dejectedly through the dark streets of Port Haven, I can tell I'll never be able to do this spell. It's too advanced for me. I'll have to ask Howl. I hate giving in, but at least I'll get some sense of Howl now that this Letty Hatter has given in to him." But this did not cheer Sophie up at all. Chapter 10, in which Calcifer promises Sophie a hint, although he's already given her 3, if you haven't noticed. Howl must have come back while Sophie and Michael were out. He came out of the bathroom while Sophie was frying breakfast on Calcifer, and sat gracefully in the chair, groomed and glowing and smelling of honeysuckle. "Dear Sophie," he said, "always busy. You were hard at work yesterday, weren't you, in spite of my advice?" Why have you made a jigsaw puzzle out of my best suit? Just a friendly inquiry, you know.
Jellied it the other day, said Sophie. I'm making it over.
Well, I can do that, said Howl. I thought I showed you I can also make you a pair of 7-league boots of your own, if you would just give me your size. Something practical and brown calf, perhaps. It's amazing the way that one can take a step 10.5 miles long and still always land in a cow pat.
It may have been a bull pat, said Sophie. I dare say you found mud from the marshes on them, too. A person my age needs a lot of exercise.
You were even busier than I realized then, said Howl. You are such a goober. Because when I happened to tear my eyes from Letty's lovely face for an instant yesterday, I could have sworn I saw your long nose poking around the corner of the house.
Mrs. Fairfax is a family friend, said Sophie. How was I to know you were there, too?
You have an instinct, Sophie, that's how, said Howl. Nothing is safe from you. If I were to court a girl who lived on an iceberg in the middle of the ocean, sooner or later, and probably sooner, I'd look up to see you swooping overhead on a broomstick. In fact, by now, I'd be disappointed if I didn't see you.
Oh, are you off to that iceberg today? Sophie retorted. From the look on Letty's face yesterday, there's nothing that need keep you there.
Oh, you wrong me, Sophie, Howl said. He sounded deeply injured. Sophie looked suspiciously sideways. Beyond the red jewel swinging in Howl's ear, his profile looked sad and noble. Long years will pass before I leave Letty, he said, and in fact I'm off to see the king again today. Satisfied, Mrs. Nose? Sophie was not sure that she believed a word of this, though it was certainly to Kingsbury, with the doorknob read down, that Howl departed after breakfast, waving Michael aside when Michael tried to consult him about that perplexing spell. Michael, since he had nothing to do, left too. He said he might as well go to Cesari's. Sophie was left alone. She still did not truly believe that what Howl had said about Letty, but she had been wrong about him before, and she only had Michael and Calcifer's word for Howl's behavior, after all. She collected up all of the blue triangles of cloth and began, guiltily, sewing them back into the silver fishing net, which was all that was left of the suit. When someone knocked at the door, she started violently, thinking it was the Scarecrow again.
Porthaven door,
Calcifer said, flickering a purple grin at her. That should be all right, then. Sophie hobbled over, opened it, blew down. There was a cart horse outside. The young fellow of 50 who was leading it wondered if Mrs. Witch had something which might stop at casting shoes all the time.
I'll see,
said Sophie. She hobbled over to the grate.
What shall I do? She whispered. Yellow powder. 4th jar, along the 2nd shelf, Calcifer whispered back. Those spells are mostly belief. Don't look uncertain when you give it to him.
So Sophie poured yellow powder into a square paper, as she had seen Michael do, and twisted it smartly, and hobbled to the door with it.
There you are, my boy. That'll stick the shoes on harder than 100 nails. You hear that, horse? You won't need a smith for the next year. That'll be a penny, thank you.
It was quite a busy day. Sophie had to put down her sewing and sell, with Calcifer's help, a spell to unblock drains, another to fetch goats, and something to make good beer. The only one that gave her any trouble was the customer who pounded on the door in Kingsbury. Sophie opened it, read down, to find a richly dressed young boy, not much older than Michael, white-faced and sweating, and wringing his hands on the doorstep. "Oh, Madam Sorceress, for pity's sake," he said. I have to fight a duel at dawn tomorrow. Give me something to make sure I'll win. I'll pay you any sum I'll pay you any sum you ask. Sophie looked over her shoulder at Calcifer, and Calcifer made a face back, meaning that there was no such thing ready-made.
Well, that wouldn't be right at all, Sophie said to the boy severely. Besides, dueling is wrong.
Well, then, just give me something that lets me have a fair chance, the lad said desperately. Sophie looked at him. He was very undersized and clearly in a great state of fear. He had that hopeless look of a person who always loses at everything.
I'll see what I can do,
Sophie said. She hobbled over to the shelves and scanned the jars. The red one, labeled cayenne, looked the most likely. Sophie poured a generous heap of it on a square of paper. She stood the human skull beside it.
because you know more about this than I do,
She muttered at it. The young man was leaning anxiously around the door to watch. Sophie took a knife and made what she hoped to look like mystic passes over the heap of pepper.
You are to make it a fair fight, she mumbled. A fair fight, understand?
She screwed up the paper and hobbled to the door with it.
Throw this in the air when the duel starts, she told the undersized young man, and it will give you the same chance as the other man. After that, whether you win or not depends on you.
The undersized young man was so grateful that he tried to give her a gold piece. Sophie refused to take it, so he gave her a 2-penny bit instead and went away whistling happily.
I feel a fraud,
Sophie said as she stowed the money under the hearthstone.
but I would like to be there to see that fight. So would I, said Calcifer. When are you going to release me so I can go and see things like that? Whenever I've got a hint about your contract. Well, you may get one later on today, said Calcifer.
Michael breezed in towards the end of the afternoon. He took an anxious look round to make sure that Howl had not come home first, and went to the bench where he got things out to make it look as if he had been busy, singing cheerfully while he did.
I envy you being able to walk all that way so easily, Sophie said,
sewing a blue triangle to a silver braid.
How's my niece?
Michael gladly left the workbench and sat on the stool by the hearth to tell her about his day. Then he asked about Sophie's. The result was that, when Howl shouldered the door open with his arms full of parcels, Michael was not even looking remotely busy. He was rolling round the stool, laughing at the duel spell. Howl backed into the door to shut it, and leaned there with a tragic attitude. "Oh, look at you all," he said. "Ruin stares me in the face. I slaved all day for you, and not one of you, not even Calcifer, could spare the time to say hello." Michael sprang up guiltily, and Calcifer said,
I never do say hello. Well, is something wrong? Said Sophie.
"That's better. Some of you are pretending to notice me at least. How kind of you to ask, Sophie. Yes, something is wrong. The king has asked me, moi, officially, to find his brother for him, with a strong hint that destroying the Witch of the Waste would come in handy too, and you all sit there and laugh." By now it was clear that Howl was in a mood to produce green slime at any second. Sophie hurriedly put her sewing away.
I'll make some hot buttered toast, she said.
"Is that all you could do in the face of tragedy?" Howl said. Make toast? No, don't get up. I've trudged here laden with stuff for you, so the least you can do is show a polite interest. Here." He tipped a shower of parcels into Sophie's lap and handed another to Michael. Mystified, Sophie unwrapped things. Several pairs of silk stockings, 2 parcels of the finest cambric petticoats, with flounces, lace and satin insets, a pair of elastic-sided boots in dove-gray suede, a lace shawl, and a dress of gray, watered silk trimmed with lace that matched the shawl. Sophie took one professional look at each and gasped. The lace alone was worth a fortune, and she stroked the silk of the dress odd. I'm sure it had pockets. Michael unwrapped a handsome new velvet suit. "You must have spent every bit that was in the silk purse," he said ungratefully. "I don't need this. You're the one who needs a new suit." Howl hooked his boot into what remained of the blue and silver suit and held it up ruefully. Sophie had been working hard, but it was still more whole than suit. "How selfless I am," he said. "But I can't send you and Sophie to blacken my name to the king in rags. The king would think I didn't look after my old mother properly. Well, Sophie, are the boots the right size?" Sophie looked up from her odd stroking. "Are you being kind or cowardly?" "Oh, thank you very much, and no, I won't." What ingratitude! Howl exclaimed, spreading out both arms. Let's have the green slime again, after which I shall be forced to move the castle 1,000 miles away and never see my lovely Letty again. Michael looked at Sophie imploringly. Sophie glowered. She saw well enough that the happiness of both of her sisters depended on her agreeing to see the king, with green slime in reserve.
You haven't asked me to do anything yet, she said. You've just said, I'm going to.
Howl smiled. You are going to, aren't you?
All right. When do you want me to go? Sophie said.
Tomorrow afternoon, said Howl. Michael can go as your footman. The king's expecting you. He sat on the stool and began explaining to her very clearly and soberly just what Sophie was to say. There was no trace in the green slime mood. Now things were going Howl's way, Sophie noticed. She wanted to slap him. I want you to do a very delicate job, Howl explained, so that the king will go on giving me work like the transport spells, but not trust me with anything like finding his brother. You must tell him how I've angered the Witch of the Waste and explain what a good son I am to you. And, but I want you to do it in such a way that he'll understand that I'm really quite useless. Howl explained in great detail. Sophie clapped her hands round the parcels and tried to take it all in, although she could not help thinking, if I was the king, I wouldn't understand a word of what the old woman was driving at. Michael, meanwhile, was hovering at Howl's elbow, trying to ask him about the perplexing spell, and Howl kept thinking of new, delicate details to tell the king and waving Michael away. No, not now, Michael! And it occurred to me, Sophie, that you might want some practice in order to not find the palace overwhelming. We don't want you coming over queer in the middle of the interview. Not yet, Michael! So I arranged for you to call on my old tutor, Mrs. Pensman. She's a grand old thing. In some ways, she's grander than the king, so you'll be quite used to that kind of thing by the time you get to the palace. By this time, Sophie was wishing that she had never agreed. She was heartily relieved when Howl at last turned to Michael. Right, Michael, your turn now. What is it? Michael waved the shiny gray paper and explained to him, in an unhappy rush, how impossible the spell seemed to be. Howl seemed faintly astonished to hear this, but then he took the paper and saying, Now, where was your problem? And he spread it out. He stared at it, and one of his eyebrows shot up. I tried it as a puzzle, and I tried doing it just as it says, but Sophie and I just couldn't catch the falling star. Oh, great gods above, Howl exclaimed. He started to laugh, and he bit his lip to stop himself. But, Michael, this isn't the spell I gave to you. Where did you find it? On the bench, in that heap of things that Sophie piled around the skull. It was the only new spell there, so I thought. Howl leapt up and sorted among the things on the bench. Ah, Sophie strikes again, he said. Things skidded right and left as he searched. I might have known. No, the proper spell isn't here. He tapped the skull thoughtfully on its brown, shiny dome. You're doing, friend. I have a notion you could come from there. I'm sure the guitar does. Sophie, dear. What? Said Sophie. Busy old fool, unruly Sophie, said Howl. Am I right in thinking that you turned my doorknob black side down and stuck your long nose through it? Just my finger, said Sophie with dignity. But you opened the door, said Howl. And the thing that Michael thinks is a spell must have got through. Didn't it occur to either of you that it doesn't look like my spells usually do? Spells often look peculiar, Michael said. What is it really? Decide what this is about. Write a second verse. Oh, Lord, he said and ran up the stairs. I'll show you, he called as his feet pounded up them. I think we wasted our time rushing around the marshes last night, Sophie said. Michael nodded gloomily. Sophie could see that he was feeling a fool. It was my fault, she said. I opened the door. What was outside? Michael asked with great interest. But Howl came charging down the stairs just then. I haven't got that book after all, he said. He seemed upset now. Michael, did I hear you say that you went out and tried to catch a shooting star? Well, yeah, but it was scared stiff and it fell in a pool and drowned. Oh, thank goodness for that. But it's very sad, Sophie said. Sad, was it? Said Howl, more upset than ever. It was your idea, wasn't it? It would be. I can just see you hopping around the marshes, encouraging him. Let me tell you that that was the most stupid thing he has ever done in his life. He would have been more sad if he had chanced to catch the thing. And you, Calcifer flickered sleepily up the chimney. What's all this fuss about? He demanded. You caught one yourself, didn't you? Yes, and I, Howl began, turning his glass marble stare on Calcifer. But he pulled himself together and turned to Michael instead. Michael, promise me that you will never try to catch one again. I promise, Michael said willingly. What is that writing if it's not a spell? Howl looked at the gray paper in his hand. It's called Song, that's what it is, I suppose, but it's not all here, and I can't remember the rest of it. He stood and thought, as if a new idea had struck him, one which obviously worried him. I feel like the next verse was important, he said. I better take back and see. He went to the door and turned the knob black down. Then he paused. He looked round at Michael and Sophie, who were, naturally enough, both staring at the knob. All right, he said. I know Sophie will squirm through somehow if I leave her behind, and that's not fair to Michael. Come along, both of you, so I've got you where I can keep both my eyes on you. He opened the door onto nothingness, and he walked into it. Michael fell over the stool in his rush to follow. Sophie shed parcels right and left into the hearth as she sprang up too. Don't let any sparks get on those, she said hurriedly to Calcifer. If you promise to tell me what's out there, Calcifer said. And you had your hint, by the way. Oh, did I? Said Sophie. She was in too much of a hurry to attend. So, that is another 2 chapters, Oh Best Beloved. And I am quite pleased with myself today. I remembered to go to the gym at my apartment complex. I managed a 10-minute mile on the elliptical because I am healthy. And I also made homemade hamburgers with venison and seasoned pork sausage. And the pork sausage definitely overweighed the venison. All that might have just been, it was store-bought venison and not like the good stuff, because most of my hunter friends keep forgetting to give it to me because they're mean. But anyway, you guys have more important things to do than listening to me blather on. So, to all of my friends, both new and returning, yes, dear, it is almost bedtime. So, get some rest and do your best to become somebody that you can be proud of. And if people can hate you without knowing you, then I can love you. Sleep well, dearest.